Hello and welcome to another session for MG316. And in today's session, we will be looking at employment relations in UK. Please note that from now onwards, we will be having our satellite tutorial on Big Blue Button, and I will also be recording this, uploading these recordings on YouTube if students are unable to access these recordings on Big Blue Button. So let's look at the context of UK's industrial relations or employment relations. Now, UK has a population of around 66 million and an employment rate of employment rate of 76%, and this is the data from 2019. Now, most of the men they work full time. They are permanent workers and they work full time, and more than 40% of the women work part-time, and this is according to the 2014 data. There has been major shifts in the sectoral division of workers. That is about 80% of workers they work in the service industry, in the service sector, and this is common with majority of the countries. You will see as we discuss other countries as well, that majority of the workforce is in the service industry compared to the primary and the manufacturing industry. There has been growth in foreign direct investment and related employment practices as well. Membership of European Union influences labor practices and standards. Now note that just this year, UK is no longer a member of European Union, but over the years, EU had influenced UK's employment relations a lot. There has been an increasing number of immigrant workers, particularly among low wage earners. And in 2020, this year, the unemployment rate was 3.9% of the labor workforce. The role of the state or the role of the government. Now, employment relations have in the past been characterized as voluntarist because of comparatively low level of legal regulation. Yet, this characterization is increasingly misleading. The British state has, in fact, been a central actor in the construction, maintenance, and reconstruction of industrial relations institutions, as said by Howard 2005. So, previously, it has been said that the role of the government has been, or the industrial relations in UK has been characterized as a voluntarist structure because the government did not put up much legislations with regards to regulating the ER and the IR environment. Some key themes, especially since 1979, the UK system has been radically reformed by interventionist legislation characterized by labor market re-regulation and attempts to foster a competitive enterprise culture. Now, what happened in 1979 was you must have heard of the name Margaret Thatcher. She came into power in 1979 and ruled till 1997, and this is when she came into power, she started to change many legislations in the country, and majority of these legislations were in favor of the employers and not the workers. And after this, the UK's ER system has been characterized as an interventionist IR or ER system. Now, reforms were initiated by the Conservative governments between 1979 and 1997. As I've said, that Margaret Thatcher was in power during this time. Many were maintained by the 97 to 2010 new Labour governments and the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government of 2010 to 2015. Combined with the broader macroeconomic trends and shifts in the labor market, such reforms have had profound effects on the UK's employment relations. The voluntarist system. So let's look at what the voluntarist ER system of UK was. Now, voluntarism arose out of trade union immunity legislation, which was the Trade Dispute Act of 1906. Please note that this legislation is no longer there. It was repealed. Currently, the ER legislation that UK has is the Employment Relations Act. I believe the year is 1999. So, principal features of voluntarism. This included non-legal binding collective agreements. Now, collective agreements are the outcome of collective bargaining process. Second one is voluntary union recognition by employers. Thirdly, low level of formalization of industrial relations structures. And fourthly, voluntary framework of state provided dispute resolution facilities, which means no power of the government to arbitrate. So these were the principal features of this voluntarist IR system. Non-legally binding collective agreements. That means even if you have a collective agreement, it's not a legal collective agreement, isn't it? Voluntary recognition, union recognition by employees. So employees, if they do not want to recognize a trade union, nothing is preventing them, forcing them to recognize the trade unions. If the employees do not want to recognize the unions, and also the government did not have any power to arbitrate. That means if there was any disputes and the two parties were unable to resolve, so state did not provide much mechanisms, or state would not force those parties to reach an agreement. And this system was supported by both the employers and the unions. They both liked it. Still looking at the government. So let's see what happened, how the IR system was changed from a voluntarist structure to an interventionist structure. In an attempt to reverse economic decline, governments from the 1970s onwards legislated industrial relations reform. The most radical of these reforms were those of the conservative Thatcher government, which was in power from 1979 to 1990s, which aimed to reduce the power of unions. Some have characterized this point in British history as the shift from a voluntarist to a neo-liberal interventionist state. Initial signs are that the Conservative government elected in 2015 will further restrict union influence. So, when this government came into power initially in 1979, it started to restrict the union movement. And you will notice if you look at the trade union density, the trend regarding the trade union density, you will notice that from 1980s onwards, the trade union density has been declining in UK, and a direct, and this was the result of the conservative Thatcher government changing many legislations in favor of the employers and restricting trade union movement. Dispute settlement. Now, the state has long provided conciliation and arbitration services to supplement voluntary collective bargaining and dispute procedures. And since 1975, these services have been offered by the independent ICAS, which stands for Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service under the Employment Protection Act of 1975. Now, ICAS is a governmental agency governed by a tripartite council of employer, union nominees with a balance of independent members. Example, academics. So these are the tripartite structure of ICAS. The members include the representatives or the employer nominees, not representatives, but the nominees of the employer, the union nominees, and some independent members such as academics. ICAS offers industrial relations advice as well as conciliation and non-compulsory and non-binding arbitration services to the parties to individual and collective agreement disputes. As the name says, advisory, conciliation, and arbitration service. So this ICAS does provide advice to the parties in dispute, does conciliation, it also does mediation, and it also does arbitration. Moving on, history of early UK unionism. As the UK was the first country to industrialize, it probably has the longest history of unionism. You must be wondering why are we studying UK first? And this is the reason why we are studying UK first is because UK was the first country to industrialize. Early unions were formed by and were exclusive to skilled craft workers. Some began before in the 19th century. Widespread unionism of semi skilled, unskilled, and female manual workers began in the late 19th century. Prior to the Second World War, which was from I believe 1939 to 1945, the majority of unionized white collar workers were in the public sector. After 1960, substantial numbers of private sector white collar workers were also unionized. So, unions initially, when they formed, they were growing, and by 1960s, private sector also joined in. White collar workers were also unionized. But then from 1979, when Thatcher came into power, trade union density has been declining. So unionism since the Second World War, we can see that the level and density of unionization has fluctuated since the end of the Second World War, and there has been three post-war phases that can be identified. So let's see these three post-war phases, starting with from 1948 to 68. Membership grew, so there has been an increase from 9.3 million to 10.2 million, and union density moved between 42% to 50% during this time. And then in the 1970s, membership again grew because now white collar workers were unionized. Note that the first type of unions to form in any country or in most of the countries are these craft workers, and these are blue collar workers. So white collar workers do not usually form the unions or start the unions. It is usually the blue collar workers that form the unions, skilled craft workers. So in 1970s, the white collar workers they also started to join union, and then again the membership increased and the density increased. So the membership reached an all-time high of 12.6 million in 1979, with the density peaking at 56%. And then what happened? Decline, decline, decline. So from 1979, between 1979 and 2013, union membership fell by more than 5 million members to 7.2 million members. So from 12.6 to 7.2, with the density falling from 56% to a mere half, or less than half, 23%. And even now, the union density is just declining in almost all the countries that we are going to study. Decline in strike, along with the decline in unionization, there has been a decline in strike activity as well. from a peak of 3,906 strikes with almost 11 million working days lost in 1970. The number of strikes fell to 122 in 2013, resulting in only 410,000 working days lost. So you can imagine, from a close to 4,000 strike in 1970 to just 122 strikes. In the 21st century, a greater proportion of strikes are defensive strikes. Decline of strike action in Britain may have been steeper than elsewhere, and this was due to restrictive legislation introduced by the Thatcher government, the Conservative Thatcher government. As I've said before, that Thatcher restricted trade union movement, and this could be one of the reasons why the the strike number fell. Moving on, how can we explain the fall in UK's trade union density? There is no agreement on the relative effects of factors that have contributed to the fall in UK unionism. Yet it is generally accepted that they include macroeconomic context, changing composition of employment and of the labor force, management resistance and workplace practices, state labor policies, issues internal to unionism. So these are some of the reasons that have contributed to the decline in trade union density. The economy itself, low economic activity or economic downturn that results in trade union density decline. People lose jobs when there is an economic downturn. And if you do not work, you are not a member of a union. You can only be a member of a union if you are working. Changing composition of the employment, more females joining the workforce, and it has been said that and usually females they work on part-time, and part-time workers usually are not members of trade unions. Management resistance, management they do not want unions, isn't it, in their workplace. Government legislations and issues internal to unionism. Probably you want to join a union for a particular reason, but the union is not fighting for that reason. So why would you join that particular trade union? Isn't it? Although the 1997 to 2010 Labour governments enacted legislation for a formal recognition procedure, the legislation did not allow these trends to be reversed. Contemporary unionism, in 2013, there were only 167 unions. That's a massive decrease from 1,348 unions in 1920. And this was a result of both union measures and falling union density. So unions have been combining. Why unions combine is to have a greater voice, basically. They want to be more powerful. Union membership is concentrated in 13 unions, accounting for 84% of total union membership. There are marked variations in union density. Unionism in the public sector is 56%, whilst trade union density in the private sector is only a 14%. And you will notice this trend in almost all the countries whereby the public sector is more unionized compared to the private sector. You can see the difference in UK. 56%, more than half of the public sector is unionized, and only 14% of private sector is unionized, and this data is for 2012. Non-manual workers are more likely to be unionized than manual workers. Unionism is slightly higher among women, 27%, than among men, which is 20%. Full-time workers are more likely to be unionized, 27%, than their part-time counterparts, which is 12%. So part-time workers usually do not unionize. Remember, to become a union member, you need to pay union fees as well. And if you are a part-time worker not earning that much, why would you want to pay that fees, isn't it? So it's better not to be a union member. Whereas compared to full-time workers, they tend to be union members. Workers over the age of 50 are more likely to be unionized, 33%, than workers aged under 25 years, which is 8%. So research has also shown that young workers tend not to join trade unions. Trade Union Congress, which is TUC. Now, the Trade Union Congress was established in 1868 and is UK's the main union confederation. So, Trade Union Congress is the umbrella body of trade union present in UK. Now, in a country, there are a number of trade unions, isn't it? And we have seen that in 2013 there were 167 unions present in UK. So who looks after all these unions? There's usually an umbrella body of trade union which looks after majority of the unions present in a country, and we call that umbrella body the National Trade Union Organization, commonly referred as the umbrella body of trade union. And in UK's case, the name is Trade Union Congress. Now, in Trade Union Congress, 54 unions representing almost 5.9 million workers are affiliated with the Trade Union Congress. Now, TUC is not directly involved in collective bargaining, but instead they primarily lobby the government on union issues. They provide services to affiliated unions and adjudicates disputes between affiliated unions. So these are the major things that TUC does. Note, TUC does not involve or is not directly involved in the collective bargaining process. Can be indirectly involved in the CB process. How? Provide advice to the unions how to do the CB, what issues to negotiate on, and the tactics and things like that. But TUC is not directly involved in the collective bargaining process. In response to declining membership, the TUC has focused on the organizing strategies in recent years, but with only limited success. So it has not been successful in increasing its membership. The union movement and the Labour Party. Now, unions were instrumental in the establishment of the Labour Party in 1906. Since the mid 1980s, the Labour Party has increasingly distanced itself from unions as it increasingly secured funding from the business sector and elsewhere. So, trade union TUC actually was the key party in establishing the Labour Party in UK. But since the mid 1980s, Labour Party is moving away, distancing itself from the unions. Now, individual unions, they choose whether to affiliate with the Labour Party or not, and some unions they do not affiliate with the Labour Party. Moving on, looking at employers and their associations. Employers associations. The Confederation of British Industry (CBI) was formed in 1965, and it is the peak organization of employers in UK, like the umbrella body of trade union. There is also the umbrella body of employer associations. Just like that, there are a number of unions present in a country, there are also a number of employer associations that are present in a country. And who looks after them? The umbrella body of employer associations. And in UK's case, it's CBI, Confederation of British Industry. Now, there is another name mentioned in the course book, which is Institute of Business Directors, IBD. Please note that IBD is not a key player in employment relations. So, hence, it is not one of the umbrella bodies of employer association in UK. The only umbrella body of employer association present in UK is CBI, Confederation of British Industry. Just like TUC, Trade Union Congress, the CBI also does not participate in collective bargaining, but it does lobby the government and EU on employer related issues. Note that UK no longer is part of EU, and claims to represent the views of 200,000 employers who employ around half of UK's workforce. There are 80 employers associations in the CBI. They typically offer one or more sets of services to their members, including ER advice, training, and lobbying services. Whilst once prominent in the voluntary system of industrial relations, employers' associations no longer play a central role due to the enhanced power and autonomy of individual employees. So now, the individual employers, they have got more power and autonomy compared to the employer association or the employers associations. So employers associations no longer play a key role. Let's look at the history of CB, history of collective bargaining. UK's collective bargaining has a long history. By the end of World War One, multi-employer bargaining for manual workers was well established, and industry-level negotiations were encouraged by the state. Multi-employer bargaining for manual workers. What this means is that we had, or they had, one agreement which covered a number of organizations, multi-employer, and industry-level negotiations. That means that in a particular industry, there is just one agreement, and everyone in that industry follows that same agreement. Industry level negotiations. This was encouraged by the state. What this means is these are centralized agreements. So before the Second World War, there were centralized negotiations across entire industries. However, there were some exceptions. This left little room for workplace bargaining. So collective bargaining in UK was initially very centralized and taking place at industry level. When collective bargaining takes place at the enterprise level or at the workplace level, then collective bargaining is said to be decentralized. So initially, collective bargaining was centralized. A shift occurred after the Second World War with the rise of single employer bargaining. So from multi-employer, multiple employees organizations having one agreement to one employer, one organization having just one agreement. And by the mid 1970s, collective bargaining was decentralized throughout much of the private sector. So this is more present in the private sector than in the public sector. That collective bargaining is decentralized, taking place at the enterprise level or at the plant level or branch level, grassroots level. These are other names of branch level collective bargaining. Changing collective bargaining. In 1970, collective bargaining covered around 70% of the UK's workforce. By 2013, coverage has declined to around 23% only. There are variations between sectors. The public sector has the highest coverage and the private sector has the lowest coverage. As we have seen, that the union density in the public sector is higher compared to the private sector. 56% in the public sector, whereas only it was a mere 14% in the private sector. The scope of collective bargaining has contracted alongside coverage, with the consequence that most of the UK's workforce have their terms and conditions of employment set unilaterally by the management. Even though it is a collective bargaining, what has happened is that the workers, the employees, they do not have much say in whatever the conditions of their the collective agreement will be. So it is mostly set by the management. Little multi-employer bargaining remains, so there is not much. So there is still multi-employer bargaining. Single unionism and single table bargaining has increased since 1990. This is where all unions negotiate together. Single table bargaining. Finally, looking at employee involvement and participation. The nature and extent of EIP employee involvement and participation programs has fluctuated over the past century. Now, note that employee involvement and participation is not compulsory in UK and it is not legislated, it is entirely voluntary. So the employers, they choose whether to involve employees in the organization or not, and if they even want to involve the employees, at what level, to what extent, is also decided by the employers. So the current form of employee involvement and participation, which gained momentum in the 1980s, differs substantially from earlier variants, as it is individualist and direct as opposed to collective and through representatives. So one employee representing himself or herself, not a group of employees, collective, and not through trade unions, that is through representatives. Initiated unilaterally by the management and not through consultation. So the management decides rather than that it is a consultation, and is directed at securing individual employee commitment to and identification with the employer. So they want employee commitment and loyalty, single employee commitment and loyalty. Fairness at work. A national minimum wage was first introduced in 1999 as a positive contribution to fairness in the workplace. Relative pay inequality has not been addressed and has been institutionalized in the form of bonuses and performance related pay. Gender inequality remains evident. Only a little progress has been made on this front beyond some redress in the form of the national minimum wage. Increased immigration raises challenges in preventing and resolving disputes over racial discrimination at work. And finally, workplace bullying and harassment generally is an issue of increasing importance. Conclusions. Since 1979, the ER and IR system has experienced substantial change from a voluntarist system to one of increased state intervention, and we have looked at that. Despite increased gentrification, there is still not a strong and central regulated IR system. Union density fell to half of its peak in 1979, and unions are struggling to find a clear identity and new roles. EU membership continues to influence domestic IR legislation. No longer, this is no longer because UK is no longer a part of EU. Okay, so that ends this satellite tutorial, employment relations in UK. Please look at the or read the textbook notes as well. I believe these textbook notes have already been uploaded on the employment relations in UK. You can make a table and then study from the table. You can have things like, first of all, brief introduction of the country, then look at trade unions in the country, look at the umbrella body of the trade union. In UK's case, it is TUC, Trade Union Congress. What are some of the things that this TUC does? The types of unions that are present in UK. Look at the density of trade union. Then you can look at employers and their association. Look at CBI. What are some of the things that CBI does? Then look at the government. Look at the three arms of the government: the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary role of the government. Look at what the government has done. Look at some of the legislations like the Employment Relations Act of 1999. Probably also look at what are some of the major political parties present in UK. The Conservative government, Labour government, yes. Then move on to the processes. Looking at dispute resolution process. ACAS is there, Advisory Conciliation and Arbitration Services. Then look at collective bargaining, shifting away from a centralized structure, multi-employer, to a decentralized single employer agreements. And finally look at employee involvement and participation. And lastly, before conclusion, look at what are some of the trends, issues and changes taking place in UK. Things like more females joining the workforce, trade union density decline, decline in collective bargaining itself, increase in individual bargaining, more immigrant workers, more part-time workers, decrease in full-time employment as well, decrease in permanent workers. All are now becoming contractual workers. 3-year contract, 5-year contract, 1-year contract. Seasonal workers, increase in seasonal workers. These are some of the trends, issues, and changes taking place in UK. So, if you have any questions, any queries with regards to employment relations in UK, you can send me an email, which is already up there on Moodle. Alright, and in our next tutorial, we are going to discuss employment relations in UK. Thank you.